Okay, we're going to continue our discussion yesterday from when we introduced CSS. And one thing that we didn't talk about much yesterday when we talked about CSS was this concept of inheritance. And what inheritance is, in the CSS world, is the idea that you can apply some properties to a parent, and those properties would be inherited by the children. And so other properties, though, however, you could apply at the parent, and they are not inherited by the children. And so, you know, that's the basic concept of inheritance, and what properties are inherited versus what properties aren't inherited are going to be kind of what we go through here. I do reference the MDN web docs. Again, this is my favorite resource for learning HTML and CSS. And, you know, yesterday we covered the cascade in the lecture pretty thoroughly. And what we didn't cover thoroughly is this concept of inheritance. So I'm going to kind of scroll past the cascade, and we touched on the rules of specificity, but we're also, that's the second part that we're going to cover here. We're going to cover CSS inheritance. We're also going to cover the CSS fun word, specificity. Gosh. All right, I think I got that right. So let's start with inheritance, and again, we can kind of come into here and just to go through this concept in to be thorough. Okay, I'm just going to read kind of slowly so that we can all process this information together. CSS inheritance. Again, some CSS property values set on a parent element are inherited by their child elements, and some aren't. Okay, and so they even, you know, give an example. If you set a color or a font family on an element, every element inside of it will also be styled with that color and font, unless you've applied a different color or font directly to them. And what I find about CSS inheritance is that a lot of this stuff just kind of makes sense. And so if we have a paragraph inside of a div, if I target a div tag and I say font color blue, and I say, you know, just as an example is the font color, div save font color blue, div paragraph, font color should be inherited. What am I doing wrong? Oh, just color. Good morning. Good morning. What am I doing wrong?
I did that too.
Yeah, you've been there before?
Yep.
All right, there we go. You know, in old HTML, there was a font tag. Side note, there used to be a font tag. And of course, it's going to bark at me for doing this, but this is no longer what we're supposed to use HTML for. As we know, HTML is not for styling. CSS is for styling. And so when I said font color, that's just coming, you know. At any rate, text color of blue, and you could see that by styling the parent, the child is blue. And so we learned right away font size, and font size, as demonstrated in the article, is also inherited. So some things are passed down from parent elements and others are not. And so that's kind of it's almost common sense, and that's what some properties do not inherit. For example, okay, if you set a width of 50% on an element, all of its descendants do not also get a 50% width of their parent. And so what you would find if I kind of come in here and I say width, and width is a property we haven't really explored very much, but safe to say you can change the height or the width of any element or any selected element. And if I kind of come back into my page, which I no longer have launched, and I inspect, now the parent being the div is 50% width, and you can see that the content is 50% wide in the blue. However, what this is saying is that the paragraph is 100% wide in the container that it's in. Okay, so what this article says is, yes, the div is 50%, but the child paragraph is not then 50% of that 50%, aka 25% of the page. Okay, so when you have a width property, you're only giving a width to the parent. It is then not being inherited 25% width of the paragraph. Just to demonstrate what that would look like, as I kind of said, you're doing it's 50% of 50. And so that really, the div is now 50%. And if I put a 50% width on the paragraph, there you go. Right? You can see now the paragraph is 50% of its parent, which is the div. The div is 50% of its parent, which is the body. So you're giving it a relative percentage to the parent container. Is how a width works. And as we mentioned here, width is one example of a property that is not inherited. A little bit more on inheritance, and here's kind of a video that I'll link to in Discord to watch. So a little bit more on inheritance, and so you can kind of see here they kind of start quickly in this demonstration with a fair amount of markup. And so we have an unordered list. That's this unordered list on the outside here. That's these bullets here. With two levels of unordered nested list inside of it. So here is a nested list. So inside of item 2, we've got this nested list. And inside of this list, we've got another nested list. And inside of this one, here's a nested list. So there's actually a secondary tier and a third tier of nested lists. And so you can kind of look at this, and here's the markup for our list. Here's our outermost list. Inside of this line item, here's a secondary nested list, a UL with LIs in it. Okay, and then inside of here, the second tier, here's that third tier. And so they even mark them item 1, 2.1, and 3.1. Anyways, to get down into it, properties like widths, as mentioned earlier, margins, and padding. We haven't talked a whole lot about margins and padding. I have used them in a couple examples, but margins and paddings are really moving things around on the page with CSS positioning. That's coming up in a chapter, but we haven't dealt with that. So width, margin, padding, and borders do not inherit. So that's kind of, those are the properties that do not inherit. And if a border were to be inherited by its children, every single list and list item would gain a border, probably not an effect everyone would want. And so I don't know, if you kind of look at this outermost list, they apply a border to main, and that, again, that's this class here. And what they're saying is if you applied a border to here, all of the children would also get borders, and that's really not what you would probably want. Which properties are inherited by default and which aren't is largely down to common sense, but I just kind of think knowing those basic rules of thumbs, what's inherited and what's not, is good to know. when we're learning CSS. There are some properties to control inheritance. I've seen these coded. I can't say that I really do this in my experience. I don't really touch this. I just let the defaults work. If you want to control inheritance, CSS gives you a property to do that. So CSS provides 4 special universal property values for controlling inheritance. It says every CSS property accepts these values. So font color is a CSS property. Width accepts this property. These accepts these values. And so even though, for example, width is not inherited, you can change that, right? So you could set the width property to inherit, and it says sets the property value applied to the selected element to be the same of its parent element. Effectively turns on inheritance. So you can turn off inheritance, you can turn on inheritance, you can modify its behavior. I don't think that's good practice. I think that confuses people when they're more than anything else, because there's kind of like the natural how it works, and I think most people are just used to that.
With the inherit but use it, there's some specifics, I guess, look that you're going for?
Yeah, some scenarios where you're like, hey, I do want these properties to inherit. I mean, again, yeah, you could turn it on. Whether that's, you think it would simplify the amount of coding that you're doing, you can maybe reduce the amount of coding that you're doing. I could see that making sense. And so here's kind of what that looks like. How we can change, again, color kind of automatically inherits, but this would be an example of turning the turning that on. So,
inherit is telling it to inherit from a parent, at least in an example with the H2, or the sidebar H2, to inherit the properties from the H2 above it. Or, I guess I'm saying the sidebar is I'm guessing probably like a menu or a nav.
Yeah, so if you think about this, says turn all H2s green. Then this would be an H2 inside of sidebar, inside of like a nav, for example. It says, but leave those in the sidebar alone so they don't use their parent's color. So they do use their parent's color. So sidebar would have its own color of font. Maybe sidebar nav would be purple font. And you would set, okay, all the H2s inside of the sidebar should inherit whatever color the sidebar is set to. Maybe that's purple. Yeah, so that's good demonstration, and maybe we could kind of code that up real quick to just demonstrate this being used. So here's an H2. Here's another H2. Here's a div with an ID of sidebar, and here's an H2 inside of sidebar. Heading 2, heading 2, heading inside of sidebar. And so let's just look at this. We got 3 headings. One's inside of sidebar. What we're going to do is we're going to target sidebar, color purple, H2, color green. And so you can see all the H2s are green because this is a more specific selector than this one. This is, even though this is an ID, it's an ID for a parent. It's not an ID for the H2 itself. And so now I can go to sidebar H2, and I say color inherit, and we should get the purple from the parent. All right, so it's a little bit more on inheritance, and the next thing I want to talk about, and this is a little bit of review from yesterday with a kind of a fun little graphic, and I guess you can kind of dig into these and look at the different values and ways to control inheritance. I don't think this is uber important because, again, I don't see this being used a ton, but you know, we've at least covered inheritance and the different ways it could be used. The next fun thing that I wanted to talk about today was specificity. And so CSS specificity, we talked about inheritance. And so let's go ahead and put an H2 back in here. And what happens, and I've seen this, when people take the same selector and they kind of forgot that they already had an H2. So I'll do one color blue and one color red. Well, when you have the same specificity on a selector, in other words, this is the same selector, so it's going to be the same level of how specific it is. When you have the same one, the rule of thumb, the way I like to think of it is the closer to the content wins, which this would load top to bottom. So the first thing this external style sheet would do is it change the color to blue, and then it would change that back to red. So it would kind of go in order, top to bottom, change it to blue, then change it to red, and there you see the one that's closer to the content wins. I can continue to demonstrate this, and if I put color green right here on my H2 selector, don't forget your selector. And we learned this a little bit yesterday, that it loads the external first, then it loads the embedded style sheets, and then it kind of does the inline stuff, and you see that H2. Now, back in developer tools, I want to show you something that is very useful, because a lot of times you're troubleshooting CSS and you can select this heading, and you could see that there are rules here that are crossed out. And what that means is that they've been overridden, right? So here on my styles.css line 1, this color of blue was applied at one point, but then it was overridden. Here we set the color to red, but then it was overridden, right? And then here we set the color to green. Okay, so when you're troubleshooting, understanding that these crossed out styles are valid selectors for this heading, right? And they would be applied, but something else is more specific, or if it's not more specific, then it's later on in the loading life cycle, if you will. It's loaded later. Okay? The big three rules, and this was on yesterday's PowerPoint, I just want to reiterate them because they're important. The big three rules when it comes to how specific selectors are, from more generic to more specific, type selectors are most generic, and then classes are more specific than that, and then IDs are more specific than that. And that's just the broad rule, okay? Turns out, if you kind of read about specificity, is that it's actually a calculation. And there's a little bit of math involved to calculate what selector is the most specific. And in my early days of learning about CSS, I got into the math. Turns out the math really isn't that important. You just got to know how to write something more specific if you need to. Specificity is a weight that is applied to a given CSS declaration, determined by the number of selectors types in the matching selector. When when multiple declarations have equal specificity, the last declared found in the CSS is applied to the element. That's what I just demonstrated. Specificity only applies when the same element is targeted by multiple declarations. So let's do another example. Let's give this H2 let's have a few H2s, and let's give this H2 a class of top. And let's kind of come up in here and say top and give it a color of brown. Okay, now based on the rules of specificity, we know that type selectors, like on line 18, type selectors are more generic than class selectors. So even if we wrote these in different order, right? Even if we wrote this in a different order, this top is more specific than the generic H2 selector, because H2 applies to all H2s. The class of top is only to whatever elements have that class. And so, as you might have guessed, this is the outcome, right? And again, I want to encourage you getting familiar with this inspect tool. If I inspect, you can see that all of these rules have been overridden and the top color of brown is actually being applied here. All three of these are coming from our styles.css or our embedded CSS. And keep in mind, this stuff, this H2 user agent style sheet, that's the browser style sheet that we talked about yesterday. Okay, so because this is more specific, this selector is more specific, and then let's go ahead and put another H2 with an ID of bottom. Keep in mind the difference between classes and IDs. An ID should only be applied to one element per page. A class can be applied multiple times on a page. That's the only difference. And if I kind of come in here and say top color whatever, crimson, okay? Now I'm also going to put a class on this. Class of, and it doesn't make sense, but I'll put the class of top. Now this H2, okay, has an ID and a class. Totally normal. You'll see that a lot throughout this class. But as you'll see, the ID is more specific than the class, thus overriding the brown and making it crimson. Or is that top? Oh, I didn't save maybe. Pound top color crimson. Pound top. Oh, I called it bottom. Gosh. ID of bottom. The ID was bottom. The ID was not top. That's just me going fast. Let me format that and launch it again. There it goes. Again, inspect it and you will see the rules of specificity being applied here. The ID of bottom overwrites the class of top and all of the element selectors. Okay, now if you boil it down a little bit more, that it is definitely more complex than this, but this is basically all you really need to know. We haven't really talked about pseudo elements. We will. We talked about class selectors, but also attribute selectors are also on this second tier. And pseudo classes, we did talk about pseudo classes yesterday, are also in this second tier. And obviously you know what IDs are. Really kind of a fun website that really breaks down all the different ways that you can have more specific CSS rules. From the most generic being the star selector, and they give a weighting of importance. Star is basically not important at all. You know, if you write a element selector, its weight is 001. A relational selector, so this is selecting the unordered list that is a descendant of a list item. You can see that's a 002. And you can see a more descendant selector like body, div, blah, 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 UL, LI, PIA. Well, you would argue that this hierarchy is more specific than this. So when you see these really long tail descendant selectors, those are more specific than general descendant selectors. And then we get into classes, and you can see that attribute selectors, like we talked about, are on the same level of class. Anyways, and then you get all the way down here to the nuke. The nuke is the important attribute. I believe we called it rule. That really, it's the nuke. So anyways.
Hold on, was that a BP oil thing coming up right on the bread?
I don't know. Yeah, I guess. This is an inline style. Inline styles, I don't recommend coding, but anyways, this is just something to throw on your bookmarks and something as reference. I'll throw it in the Discord chat as something to be more familiar with. As you kind of go down, basically it goes from, again, you can kind of see it here, the general tags down into the classes, down into the IDs, down into the inline styles, and ultimately the nuke of importance. So that's just kind of it's kind of a fun little graphic and a fun little word, specificity. Ha ha ha. Okay. All right, I'm gonna stop that. I want to keep this short and sweet, and let's see if I did that. Ooh, that's long, 27 minutes. Darn. Okay, that's all right.